Hey everyone, this is Matthew, aka Sentient Number 6. In this video, I'm going to be walking through a Neuro bass patch that I made, kind of talking about the sound design process that I use when creating sounds like this, and the workflow that I'm incorporating when I use these kinds of sounds in dark side tracks. So here's the sound. So yeah, it's it's a dirty, heavy, gritty neurofunk bass, inspired by artists like Noisia, Billin, Joe Ford, and that kind of heavier, darker side of the spectrum of drum and bass. So I'm gonna go ahead and take all the plugins off, open up the Serum patch, and kind of talk about how I made this sound from start to finish. So I'm gonna go ahead and take all the effects in Serum off as well. And let's go back to the main panel. So it's a one oscillator sound. You can really use any wavetable. It doesn't really matter a whole lot because really the magic of the sound is happening in the effects section. So yeah, just two unison voices with a little bit of detune, kind of like, that's like standard practice for drum and bass kind of sounds because you want like a bit of stereo width from the get-go. This first LFO is moving very slowly and moving through a very small portion of the wavetable position knob, just to give some subtle movement from the start. Again, like my thought process is that I want to create as much movement in the synth as I can before adding plugins, because I feel like I have more control over the sound that way. So I like to use either the mirror warping or the bend minus warping. I find that either of those will add some nice like high-end sizzle and crunch. Yeah, I think they sound nice. And then I'm using the sub oscillator, pulse wave, the same octave as the main oscillator, just to kind of reinforce the harmonic spectrum a bit more. And then this noise oscillator is this is a trick that I learned from a Joe Ford production video. He's an incredible producer. Definitely check out his music if you haven't before. So essentially what's happening here is the volume of this noise oscillator is being rapidly automated by this LFO here. It's going 31.6 hertz, so it's quite fast for an LFO. And what this is doing, if I turn this up more, you can hear that kind of high-end sizzle that's happening as a result of this. And I like that because without this, right, the sound's a bit kind of dull, a bit lacking in the high end. So I find that this kind of fills out the spectrum right from the start. Now, one thing I'm doing in this LFO actually is I'm automating the rate of this LFO. It's kind of hard to see because it's moving so fast as it is, but I'm using LFO 5 here as it's going up and down in a triangle. I'm using LFO 5. What you do, you can't just drag it, because if you click on this, it's going to give you the parameters for LFO 5, and that doesn't work. So if I click on LFO 6 and you right click on the rate, mod source, and then LFO 5 is what I'm using for that. So yeah, both oscillator A and the sub, as well as the noise filter, are all going in, or sorry, the noise oscillator are all going into the filter. It's just a high pass notch, dual filter, a little bit of drive, a little bit of resonance. LFO 4 here, just some kind of like non-linear triangle movement, controlling the frequency of the high pass, and then it's just a simple triangle wave, I believe. Where is it? On the on the notch, just moving up and down slowly. Yeah, the amp envelope is fully open, just standard default Serum envelope. I didn't even touch it for this sound. I think that's it for the main panel. Oh yeah, keeping it in mono. Portamento, just so that the notes will slide from one to the next. So let's check out the effects. This is, again, where the majority of the movement of the sound is happening. So I like to put the phaser on right away, because I think that putting the phaser into the distortion sounds nice. I don't know, I like to use that kind of signal flow a lot in my sounds. So you see that the mix of the phaser is being automated by envelope 2 here, and this envelope is it's like a quick up and down, open close sort of movement, and I'm using that on quite a few things in the effects rack here. And essentially what I'm doing with this is I'm trying to emphasize the attack of the sound, to make it a bit more aggressive, make it kind of jump out at you. So yeah, if I turn the distortion on, you can kind of start to hear a bit more of that movement that I'm talking about. And now this filter here, this reverb filter, if I turn this on, this is really where a lot of the character of the sound starts to come through. I really like this this reverb filter in Serum. If you turn the resonance up and you mess with the damping and the drive, you get some almost comb filter-like harmonics and movement. And I just really like the kind of character this adds to a sound. So you can see I'm automating the cutoff frequency, the resonance, the panning, and the mix. The mix is being automated with that same envelope that I used for the distortion drive and the phaser mix. So at this point, I think I'm starting to reuse LFOs that I used on the first page. Yeah, so this is like the same LFO that was controlling the high pass filter frequency. This is controlling the resonance of the reverb filter, and that's going to bring out more and more harmonics as the frequency, the cutoff frequency of the reverb filter moves. So yeah, you can just see it. These are all, I'm pretty much just using triangle waves on all these LFOs. They're all unsynced, and I think that's a pretty key aspect there. I don't like to use BPM synced LFOs a whole lot because I like the randomness that you get when you have unsynced free running LFOs. You know, you never really get the same hit from the same sound twice. Yeah, I'll talk about that a bit more when I'm talking about like the workflow when incorporating these kinds of sounds into a track. So yeah, also automating the mix with this envelope, the same one that I was using for these two, and the panning as well on the filters is being automated by another LFO. And again, I'm just trying to add some stereo movement in many different layers, right? So I have this pan moving, I had this panning moving, as well as the unison on that oscillator. So moving on, the compressor, right? I'm using the multiband mode, and this is really adding like a lot of drive, a lot of volume essentially to the sound. Keeping the threshold at -12, similar amount of makeup gain. Attack is pretty low. Release, you know, pretty moderate. Ratios at 3:1. And you just kind of dial in the distribution of the bands by ear, trying to make it sound pretty even. Not a whole lot else to say about the multiband compression. Now the EQ, I really like to use the EQ in Serum's effects rack as another dual filter because I'm using this reverb filter here. That's adding a lot of character. I still want to add more movement with notch filters. Essentially, notch filters are like the key ingredient to these kinds of neuro basses. Yeah, notch filters are essential for adding more and more movement. So this envelope 2 is again, this is automating the width of this notch right here. So you can see as the sound hits, that notch gets wider and then kind of closes back in. And I'm using LFOs again to move each of these notches up and down the frequency spectrum. And another LFO is controlling the EQ. The same LFO that I was using for the resonance of the reverb and the frequency of the high pass filter is opening and closing the notch on this band. So I really like using the EQ in that regard, just you know, having a second dual filter essentially. And yeah, just some hyperdimension at the end to give a bit more stereo width, just 2 unison voices, pretty modest on the dry wet. Just kind of widening the sound a little bit more. So I think that just about does it for the Serum patch. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of automation. Oh, I didn't talk about this. I like to automate the pitch a lot on these kinds of sounds. Again, because I like to use these sounds as more of like an effect or a texture in a sound rather than, in a track. And not so much as like a melodic element or a harmonic element. So I'm not so concerned about keeping like a distinct fundamental that's like pitched and like locked to a scale or a key. So I'm using LFO 5, just another triangle wave, and that's doing some bipolar automation on the pitch of the sound. So it's going 7 semitones up as well as 7 semitones down. And again, that's just adding more and more movement to the sound. So yeah, I mean, and if you are concerned with making sure that the pitch of the sound is in key with your track, you can always pitch bend the sound later, either when you put it into a sampler or just using Ableton's warping modes. So yeah, let's talk about the plugins. I'm using FabFilter Pro Q3. Not a whole lot to say about it, low shelving and high shelving, just to kind of tame some of those frequencies, some boost in the higher mids. And then this band here, I'm using the dynamic EQ function on Pro Q3. Yeah, 500 hertz can be kind of boxy, kind of muddy sounding. And so it's just a, 2.65 dB dip at this band, but you can see that this band is reacting to the incoming signal. So whenever there's a bunch of energy that builds up in that area, the band will duck down to compensate for that. All right, so moving on, I'm using Filter Freak a lot, adding a lot more notch filter movement. Just a 4-pole filter. Just, again, triangle, LFO, unsynced, sweeping up and down. I'm not using any distortion on this one quite yet. Just that one's just adding a bit more subtle movement. Using the saturation knob from Softtube. I believe this is still a free plugin from them. It's a really great analog modeled saturator. Just one knob, really easy to use. Sounds great. Just kind of pushing the sound into saturation, into distortion a bit with that. And then more notch filtering. So another 6-pole notch. This one's focusing more on like the higher frequencies. Adding just a tiny bit of the dirt distortion. This is what I love about Filter Freak, is that it has all these different distortion modes that can add a lot of character to your sounds. You don't have to use Filter Freak. I mean, Autofilter in Ableton works just as well. You can use that as a notch filter, and it also has different distortion algorithms in it, so you can totally just use that instead. Yep, same thing. So, and then this Filter Freak, I believe, is doing the exact same thing, except I'm using an envelope follower instead of a LFO on this one. So again, this is reacting. You can see that the filter is only moving when the sound is incoming. So you have some threshold controls and stuff, and it's, again, just scooping out some mid-range as the transient of the sound hits. It's kind of the same concept as what I was doing with that envelope 2 on all these effects parameters. And yeah, I'm not using any OTT. Instead of that, I like to use Camel Fat. This plugin, I don't believe you can buy it anymore. I think Camel Audio doesn't exist. I think they got bought by Apple. So it's kind of a hard plugin to find, but it's really popular amongst drum and bass producers. It sounds really fat on like drums and bass. Go figure. All I'm doing with this is a little bit of a compression. The compressor in Camel Fat is pretty extreme. As you can see, the sound is pretty brick-walled by that. And then just a tiny bit of the tube distortion, and taking some of the volume down just to try to like level match the sound. So that about does it. It's really just a process of listening and dialing in a lot of automation on as many parameters as you want, in Serum, and then using plugins after the fact just to kind of reemphasize some movement, tame problem frequencies with EQ, add some distortion and compression if you want. So because Serum is pretty CPU intensive, especially if you're working on a laptop, and using a lot of plugins in a chain, sometimes I'll use anywhere from like 10 to 20 of these Filter Freaks to make one sound, and so that can get crazy CPU intensive. And so I find it's best to bounce out these sounds to audio. So the easiest way that I find to do that is if I create an extra audio track, I'll set the input to this channel, one Serum X64, right? It's the same channel that I was using for the VST. If I record enable both of these sounds and hit record, I'm able to just record as I play notes, and then I have a nice audio file with some hits from the sound. And then what I do is I create a MIDI track, and I use Simpler in Ableton and I just drag that audio file that we just recorded into Simpler using the slicing mode. This is great because it will just automatically map each of these hits. It kind of auto detects the transients. You can move these around if you need to, but it essentially maps each of these slices of the sound to a different MIDI note, so you can very easily play. You can play the sound that you just recorded, tweaking these transient markers, getting rid of the ones that are empty, moving the start point just so you don't have like 64 MIDI notes on your keyboard. And so I find this is a lot easier when you're making a track, right? Because at this point I can just save this, I can rename this. And I can save it for later use, save it, and now it's in my user library, presets, instruments, Simpler, and I can just drag and drop that into a track, and then I have those sounds that I just recorded, and I can play them on a keyboard. I can write in the pattern with MIDI notes, and I find that to be a lot easier than manually going through and like chopping up the sound and arranging them by hand in arrangement view. Oops. So yeah, that about does it for how I like to work with like neuro-based kinds of sounds. Again, I'll be uploading that serum patch in the video description if you all want to take a crack at it and reverse engineer it. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed.